welcome to Children and Young People, Croeso I Cyfarfod, Plant a Pobl Ifanc. I'm Tudor Thomas, I'm the chair of this meeting, and I obviously welcome both the members of the committee to the meeting, but also welcome people who might be watching this on live stream at home. We'll introduce ourselves as we go along, so when somebody speaks they will say who they are and what their role is, so that people at home are clear who is speaking. We move now to the agenda, and the first item on the agenda is to note the appointment of County Councillor Tudor Thomas as chair, and that is obviously me, so I will be carrying on now until next May in this role. The second item on the agenda is the appointment of a vice chair. And do I have any nominations, please? Councillor Joe Watkins.
Good morning. I'm Councillor Joe Watkins, member of this committee and councillor for Caldecott Castle Ward. I'd like to nominate Louise Brown, Councillor Louise Brown, for the post of vice chair.
Okay.
Can I, Maureen Powell, County Councillor for Castle Ward and Abergavenny and a member of this committee, may I second Louise Brown, please?
Okay, thanks. Are there any other nominations? No. Are the committee happy for Councillor Louise Brown, member for Shire Newton, to become the vice chair of this committee? And importantly, is Louise happy to take on the role? Martin, Councillor Martin Grocott?
Yep. No, just happy with that and concur.
Okay, thank you. Louise?
Yes, thank you very much. Just to introduce myself, good morning. I'm Councillor Louise Brown and now Vice Chair of this committee, and my ward is Shire Newton Ward. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm taking it without going around for, as it were, a show of hands. Is there any dissension that Louise should carry out and should be the Vice Chair? No. Well, Louise then obviously becomes the Vice Chair of this committee. We move now then to item 3, apologies for absence. Any apologies for absence? Rob McGowan, please.
Yes, we have David Hughes-Jones, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any other apologies for absence? No. Okay. Number 4, declarations of interest. If there are, then obviously please declare that as the items, we go through the items on the agenda. Item agenda 5, public open forum. I'm not aware of anybody wishing to address the meeting today. So we've covered item 5. We now move to item 6, and I'd like to welcome Jane Rogers, who is the Senior Officer for Children's Services, and she is going to take us through some slides which we've had in advance, but will obviously be shown today, looking at the support that social services offers for vulnerable children. So I hand over now to Jane Rogers, please.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much, Chair. I have with me a colleague, Rebecca Stanton. Rebecca, is it okay if Rebecca introduces herself, Chair?
Yes, by all means. Thank you, Jane.
Hiya, good morning all. Yeah, I'm Rebecca Stanton. I'm a team manager for early help and wellbeing services and children's services. So thank you for having me today.
And Chair, how would you like me to do this? Shall I share the screen?
I think that would be helpful, please.
Okay, if you give me a moment while I do that.
Yeah, we'll do that.
That should be sharing now, is that?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Jane.
Yeah. So Rebecca and I will do this a little bit between us. And I was asked to join the committee today to say a little bit about what children's services have been up to during the last few months, whilst we've all been working under the pressures of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've put this brief PowerPoint together to sort of help us share some of what we've been doing and how we've responded as a service. So just to say to begin with, when we sort of moved into this period of time, we were working under some operational sort of direction and frameworks that came down from Welsh Government at a higher level. Those were then sort of translated and made more operational at a regional level under the auspices of the Regional Partnership Board. Those sort of set out in a broader brushstroke way some of the operational guidance that we should be working to across the 5 Gwent authorities. And that was really helpful in the sense that it brought our partners into that discussion. All the 5 local authority children's services were working in similar ways in our relationships with health, the courts, the police, etc. And then as a local service, we clearly translated that down again into how it would affect our local delivery and specific services. So we weren't sort of just coming at this from our own point of view, we were working all the time in accordance with the direction that was set out for us through national guidance and regional guidance too. And one of the things that we've always tried to make clear within children's services during this period is that we've never ceased as a service. We've continued to deliver our business and provide services to vulnerable children and families. We've just had to do it in a very, very different way. So the first couple of months was really spent both responding but also trying to work out the ways that we needed to do it in that on the ground sense. One of the very first things that we did was to really look at each of our cases and areas of business within the service to really look in a detailed way as to how we could carry on that business as usual, either through a totally virtual way or a mixture of both virtual and in the face, in the flesh responses, or whether there were some situations where from the very outset we would still have to respond through direct working, going to see families or children. And that applied to sort of all our individual cases, all our cases that were open to us right across the whole service, but also as a sort of team approach as well. So there were very, very few teams that sort of opted for the total virtual way, but there were some. So at the very beginning, our family time team, our contact team, stopped doing direct contact with families and we became virtual. That's no longer the case now. And also one of our early help services, the Building Stronger Families, went on to a totally virtual platform to deliver services, but pretty much the majority of every other team either offered a blended approach to each case or a non-virtual approach to each case. And when we were sort of thinking about how we approached that sort of work, we very quickly worked up an assessment process to sort of screen those cases and individual services, and it was a two-pronged approach to that. So it's firstly to ask ourselves, can what we want to achieve with this family be done virtually, working on the principle that if it could be done virtually, it should be done virtually. And some of the questions that we sort of helped to work the answer to that out are listed on the can the visit be done virtually square there. And if it worked out, if we came to the conclusion that the risks or the needs in a particular case couldn't be addressed, or we couldn't assure ourselves that child safety was being maintained virtually, and we had to go and do a face-to-face home visit or undertake a piece of direct work non-virtually with a child or a family, then we had to go through a set of questions asking ourselves how that piece of work could be undertaken in the safest way possible, using creative ways of seeing people, making sure that we were using PPE appropriately, and making sure that the family were working with us during any particular home visit to try and keep everybody as safe as possible. So that gives us a bit of a flavour of the sort of the out of the tracks sort of overall response and some of the things that helped us structure our work in the early days. And as you will probably be aware, within children's services, quite a lot of our services sit outside of the statutory front door of children's services and are more concerned with early help and preventative. And I'm just going to ask Rebecca to come in now and talk a little bit about how those services responded and what they continue to do with vulnerable families. Is that okay, Rebecca?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, as Jane has mentioned, within the pressures of COVID-19, we really wanted to formulate an active response for families and young people that, were not only known to us, but that weren't known to us actually as well. So with that in mind, that's why when some of our preventative services were going virtual, we had some flexibility, and the flexibility enabled us to have a wider reach in terms of what we could put out there. So I think probably some of you have seen on social media, we turned to social media as a way to really reach out to support young people and families. And we set up an advice line within 2 days of lockdown. And that advice line really was to capture some of the people that like we already knew, but also for those who might have been struggling and wanted to kind of seek that extra support through us in addition. So as you can see there, we had 154 calls between March and September. And they were just the actual calls, so the actual contacts that came in. However, the work after that contact might be a significant piece of work. So that might have been a call for some support around kind of parental activity, support for parents with, their emotions, or parenting strategies. But we also had young people calling that line with the kind of stress and pressure around COVID-19 and them being kind of at home, stuck at home, really kind of unable to manage their emotions. So the line was really a kind of open for all type door really. And then we really married that up with our early help panel. So those of you who are unfamiliar with the early help panel, that's our kind of front door for early help and preventative services in Monmouthshire, and we work very closely with health on that. So what the advice line enabled us to do then was, if there was further support on that early help panel, we were able to translate that into an early help panel referral and then get the support for the family and young people that they need as a kind of follow-on from that advice line call. So self-referral into those services, and they could have been a mixture of outcomes really that have come from that. And the early help panel stayed virtual throughout the whole of COVID. So we were still holding those panel meetings, still having formulation meetings around the support that we needed to give to young people and families. And also when the schools closed, around the summer holidays, we were liaising really closely with our education partners to make sure that there was a real contained handover, and to make sure that once the summer holidays started, that we were still giving as much support as we possibly could, given that some of those kind of school supports weren't there through that summer holidays. So that really worked well in that respect. And I think the subjects around close connectivity between teams and other partners was a real key to some of the work that we did through COVID, through the COVID kind of pandemic. So some of the things around making sure there was no duplication happening between our different partners, making sure that teams were talking to one another, even if we weren't physically with each other, that we were ensuring that communication was happening all of the time through virtual means or through emails or through phone calls, because actually when we don't speak to one another, that's when things could potentially be detrimental to the family support package. So, really working hard to make sure that those conversations were still happening on a regular basis. So another part of that was the resource packs as well. So we were sending out resource pack for families and young people who needed extra support. So they could be anything from kind of school activities to activities around parenting to activities around emotional well-being and support. And we offered those out as well via email and via text message as well, to make sure that there was accessibility for those to access those packages. The other thing that happened, our statutory school-based counselling team that you might be familiar with, we have always run that as a face-to-face service. However, very quickly we realised that wasn't going to work with the pressures of COVID. So we moved on to a whole new online platform, which enabled us to do one or two things really. One, be able to see young people that we were seeing face-to-face on an online safe platform, but also enable us to do drop-in sessions so that young people could kind of come in and speak to us if they weren't known to us in face-to-face already, which we found as well. We were getting young people that were coming through that virtual door, if you like, that we had never known about in the service previously. So that again really opened that opportunity for young people to come through, and we ended up doing some virtual groups as well, especially around transition for those year 6 young people who were moving up to year 7. An anxiety provoking time at the best of times, let alone with COVID on top. So we were doing that support around that transition from year 6 to 7, especially young people that were really anxious about that move really. The other element of that is the Circle of Security and the MVR programme. So Circle of Security is an attachment-based parenting programme that we've been running for about 2 years now in Monmouthshire. And actually we had parents that were in the middle of those programmes when COVID hit, and also some people that were waiting for those programmes. And we know how important that kind of continuation of the therapeutic intervention is. So we ensured that we moved that to a virtual means as well, so that we could still help and support parents with that programme that they had, started only a few weeks prior. And actually the continuity of that was really important for the parents that were already engaged with that. And in terms of NVR, that's non-violent resistance. Again, that's around supporting families in how to deal with situations and how to de-escalate situations with themselves and their young people and children. And given COVID and the pressures that were put on parents and families during that time, that was a really useful tool, I think, as well, to support parents in how they can deal with escalation of situations, not only in their own family unit, but in the wider field, because of the media, because of news reports and all the other things that were kind of putting on young people and families within that time, really. Some of the, so I think I've touched on the social media thing, so that's absolutely fine. So that worked really well. And then just the other thing to really include is that multidisciplinary approach, really. So I think I touched on that earlier about really making sure that we are talking to, professionals within our teams and in the local authority, but that also extended to health as well, making sure that we're having a coordinated response for those young people that we were particularly concerned about and were vulnerable, making sure that that service was continued to make sure their packages of support were well sequenced and also a bespoke approach in terms of what they needed from us as well. I think that's my slide, Jane. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so there was a lot going on, wasn't there, Rebecca? That's for sure. And I hope that gave you some impression of just what exactly was happening. So obviously then part of children's services, key part is to work with children where we already are concerned about the level of harm that they might be exposed to, or children who are confirmed to be at risk from harm. So that's what we call our sort of statutory through the front door children's services. So our very early help and assessment team, our front door was fully operational. We retained a skeleton staff that would come in and work non-virtually every day, just because that's the main sort of team where all our, if anybody wants to raise a concern about a child, that is the hub of where those concerns come into. So it's a quick moving team. We're responding to concerns daily, more often than not by going out, possibly jointly with the police too. So that retained a fully operational role, albeit with a skeleton staff and the rest of the team working virtually. We had a duty system that worked from e-block every day. And you know, just a note there that actually some authorities did experience a slight dip in the level of concerns and referrals that were made to the department, but we in Monmouthshire didn't. It's difficult to explain sort of why that is, but I think it's because a whole range of reasons. But we were, although it was a pressure for us, I think we were. It was a sort of reassuring to know that there wasn't a massive drop off in referrals, and we were able to respond to kind of needs, issues, and vulnerabilities as they were being found in the community and by other agencies. We noticed a slight change, that we were getting more direct referrals from parents, and we obviously then work closely with Rebecca's part of the world to make sure that where parents could be supported better by the advice line or by early help services, we were able to sort of reroute in that direction. So our section 47, so our child protection inquiries carried out as they were before. Of course, where we could do it virtually, we did, but more often than not, that did involve at least one home visit. Our statutory visits continued, using lots of blended approaches for children who were on the register. We had parenting work that was conducted virtually. A lot of parents found that different, but actually in the end helpful. There was a couple of comments around, you know, it somehow can be easier to engage and really tune in to the work that's happening on a virtual platform rather than sometimes in person, where other things kind of come in and the normal routines of the household are ongoing. When parents were engaged with their workers virtually, sometimes, not in every case, there could be that better engagement. For many of the children on the register, we did a sort of blended approach. You know, some of the actual interventions, the work that needed to take place with that family was virtual, whereas we maintained statutory visits on a physical check that children were okay. I mean, that was particularly during the school closure period. Working carefully as well with other agencies, so there wasn't lots of different people going in, but we were checking that children were seen where they needed to be. So we progressed many of our families through during the COVID period. Our court work continued, which meant that we were able to bring families to conclusion where depending where they were in their sort of care planning, which meant that our family support services such as Monmouthshire Families Together, ACT, Achieving Change Together, they were going in, providing the interventions for families and allowing us then through the court process to reach final outcomes for particular children and young people. Our court operated through a blended approach, so it's quite a thing really. There was our legal team and the social worker sat in the conference room with the actual court hearing coming through the television. So there was people in different locations, some of them co-located together with the court hearing going on. And although that really did take some getting used to, it did allow cases to progress that needed to progress. And certainly during this COVID period, we've had revocations of parenting orders, we've had people made subject of ICOs, we've even progressed one child through to adoption. So work really did carry on. One of the things that we did jointly between ourselves and education was to look across our caseload within children's services and try to identify those who would really benefit from the hubs that were put into place whilst there was some of the school closures were going on. We met between ourselves and education, I think it was weekly at times, to really see what was going on, to see whether some of our more vulnerable children were able to engage in the home in the hubs, or whether they were properly engaging in home schooling. So as I said before, and I couldn't really stress it, our work just carried on. It just looked very different.
Mm-hmm.
Rebecca, did you want to come in briefly then about some of our family support work in a bit more detail?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you, Jane. So as Jane has alluded to, there was a mixture of kind of virtual and face-to-face depending on the needs. And our family support team that kind of across different parts of the service were very good at adjusting to the needs of the young people and families. So where appropriate, they found ways of doing that outside, doing that within gardens, obviously being very mindful of confidentiality, but really adapting and finding ways to still see families and young people. Obviously all the work was very carefully risk assessed, but actually they found lots of different ways of engaging virtually or through gardens or through meetups outside, you know, in line with some of the procedures and stuff that were along at that time. The other huge thing I think that we did across that period was working with Owen Wils's team, who sit in the partnerships team, and they set up that community response whereby they were kind of linking in with food banks and delivering packages to vulnerable families. Now, linking in with that team really enabled us to have a more joined up approach. So when families were asking for food packages or when there was vulnerabilities around stuff that they needed, that was then communicated with us in children's services so that we could follow that up to ensure families had everything that they needed when they were asking packages, or we could speak to that team delivering the food packages to make sure that that was safe enough in order for them to visit, and also like making sure that we were kind of speaking from one hymn sheet really, rather than all these individuals going into the home at different times. During the period as well, we were doing virtual family group conferences still, which we normally do face to face, and that was to really help families and our staff come up with safety plans, come up with plans around contact arrangements virtually, and also enable when things kind of did escalate with families, to enable us to really have a plan around how we support that, so that we were kind of managing chaotic situations or really vulnerable situations in an appropriate way, really. And then the only other thing to mention as well over that is the resource sharing happened across the team. So even though there's various different support workers that sit in family support and protection, in the early help team, in the long-term team, all the family support workers were liaising as one to make sure that there wasn't any duplication, to make use of all the resources that we had available to us, so that we weren't wasting time kind of gathering things that already someone else in the system has already got. So I think that was also a really successful thing in terms of that, and I think we'll keep that, won't we, Jane?
Yeah, lots of it we will keep.
Yeah, thank you.
So just a few other little examples from different parts of our service. There's one of the teams in children's services works specifically with children with disabilities, and we found with some of our most vulnerable children during this period, especially if they were part of a sibling group, none of the children at school, the children with disabilities, particularly where they have maybe school placements out of county, weren't able to access any of the sort of support hubs that had been put into place. So families were under immense pressure, especially for children who maybe were on the autistic spectrum. You can just, I mean, some of what families were coping is just hard to imagine, really, from having sort of a nice structured week with all the siblings at school, their children with additional needs at school, and their week nicely organised, to suddenly having and managing a group of children at home, one of whom had, or more than one of whom had, sort of ASD. So we have our disability support services for children's services are provided by Action for Children. So we worked really intensively and in close partnership with Action for Children to really reprofile how they delivered services for us, because obviously some of what they deliver they couldn't deliver because of the lockdown restrictions. So we worked really closely with them. We provided very intensive to support families who were most at risk of breakdown because of the additional needs of their children. And in some cases, additionally, social workers were providing almost daily calls for some parents who were really finding this a very difficult period of their lives for obvious reasons. So, more than any other team, there was a lot of intense emotional support going on to families there who perhaps before would only provided minimal sort of intervention support. That was all that was required. Suddenly we were into a different ball game altogether. We worked with CYP where we could to enable access school hubs. We maintained our respite provision, although we didn't do overnight stays. They were able to provide day respite for some children. And we also were able to put in 3 summer play schemes at the 3 different sites within Monmouthshire, again using Action for Children and also diverting some additional resource from what would normally be the council's play schemes that couldn't go on. We were able to redirect some of that resource so that we were able to support more children with disabilities over that summer period. We had families using their direct payments creatively. One of those families, instead of using their direct payments to support an ongoing physical support worker to come and provide respite and activities for their child, created a sensory garden out of their direct payments money just to help during that summer period. So lots of creative work, lots of support, and some great partnership working with Action for Children to make sure that our particularly vulnerable families were supported. And thankfully none of our children with disabilities who were at very high risk, I think, did actually come into care. They were all maintained within their family settings. Of course, we had a big job on our hands to support foster carers, again, who found themselves in similar positions without the sort of daily routines of school and so forth. But our fostering service continued. We upped our telephone support. We created a really lovely sort of weekly newsletter to keep foster carers connected, and that's something we'll certainly be carrying on after this period has ended. It again very much visual business as normal. So where children did have to come into placements or placement moves were needed, we were able to use digital methods to ensure that the child had met the carers, that had seen the house, all through virtual introductions. We carried on with our fostering and recruitment work and undertaking assessments. So clearly a lot of the one-to-one, the sort of assessment sort of questions could be asked virtually. There was good engagement with new carers coming on, but we then did make sure that we did a home visit as well, obviously risk assessed. Panel continued, and our training for foster carers continued over digital platform. Similarly for children who were looked after, a lot of this for us centred around how we would continue to allow good family time between children who were looked after and their birth parents or siblings. So a lot of work went on to try and make that good quality time for children and families, even though it was over virtual platforms, and we only ceased the service for a minimum time. As soon as we were able to, in terms of any of these up of restrictions, we started to put in more opportunities for children and parents and siblings to meet together without having to use virtual means. But we've had to totally sort of re-engineer our contact centres to allow that to happen. For some parents who didn't have the means to use the full range of digital platforms that other parents may have at their availability, we encourage parents to come into the centres in a safe way, of course, to enable them and facilitate them using the technology that was to have their family time with the children. We're now at a stage where nearly, I should say, all our children are having some level of actual non-virtual face-to-face time with their families. We continue to undertake our statutory visits to children who were looked after. We sort of had a good sense, particularly for young people who had left care, of who was the most vulnerable, and really upped our level of contact with those who were more vulnerable. For all our care leavers now, we provided mobile phone top-up so that we really could keep in touch with them. And, you know, young people's lives continued. So there were several young people who, one way or the other, needed to move accommodation, they needed support with benefits issues, they needed a lot of advice and guidance about what they should and shouldn't be doing during the COVID period. So all that just continued really, but all through various means and through risk assessed approaches. So, you know, we were busy as a service, and it didn't stop, as I said. We just had to get used to doing it in different ways, and there were certainly barriers and challenges, but also some hidden benefits to some of the things that we did. And just a few little quotes that we have heard in one way or the other right throughout this period. But some of the good ones there are really about the quality of the engagement that some children, families and young people had with their workers and with each other. I think sometimes it's that how at ease young people are with communicating through virtual methods, and also the fact that they were quite a captive audience at times. Some social workers said that they've never had a better engagement with some of the children and families, young people that they were working with. The impact definitely on the workforce, though, and of having to conduct what might be a really difficult session with a parent or deliver a difficult message to a parent from through a kind of laptop in their home, and then feeling that feeling of the session and how difficult that was, or if they were having to deal with some high emotions that were sort of left in their home rather than being able to sort of leave it at the door of the workplace. So some nice little quotes there from various places within the service. And, you know, whilst we're on that, really, I think Rebecca and I both felt that, you know, we did deliver as a service, we did carry on working and supporting, providing services, but the heart of that was really us understanding the needs of the workforce and the welfare of the workforce, and how difficult it was at times for workforce people to adapt so quickly to what we were asking them to do without the sort of face-to-face support of their teams, having to get used to working from home when they've got their own family issues going on, having to get used to digital approach, losing that sense of being able to debrief in a direct way, losing the kind of absorption of culture, practice, knowledge of families that you get from actually working at an office location. So we, as a service, had to really pay attention to that, because they are the people that make the service work. They are the people who deliver to our children and families. So their welfare was really at the heart of some of our responses. And I was one thing that particularly struck me was I just gone into E-Block just one day for something that I had to do, and met a social worker who had joined us during the lockdown period, and it was on one of the quotes from the side before, and she said, gosh, it's just been so strange, so challenging. I've come from, you know, being a frontline social worker with my team around me, with out and about, knowing my children and families, to coming into a service where I've never met my team other than through a screen, where all the children on my caseload I'm only again sort of seeing predominantly through virtual means. She said, I've been joking to some of the younger children that she works with, going, you know, I actually have a body. I'm not just a face. And I just, you know, listening to her, it really struck home to me just how challenging it has been for our workforce, and what an amazing sort of job they've done just to kind of get through this and carry on delivering those services. So, you know, thinking about what we're doing now and what our future sort of is looking like, this, it is that feeling of keeping on, and it is a bit of a sense of, with a slightly, you know, we've learned loads, but a slightly daunted mentality, I think, as we sort of come into this winter period. Of course, we're having to adapt and respond as restrictions come and go, really keeping abreast of the national, regional and that local situation, so that we're working in the right way to both deliver a service but manage the risks of the pandemic as well. We're learning about how this situation is impacting on families. We're learning about what's affecting families more and more. Referral rates, certainly since schools have gone back, have very much gone up, as we'd have expected. But, you know, socially, this is having a huge immediate and long-term effect on the welfare of our families, and therefore our children and young people within Monmouthshire. We've got all kinds of decisions to make about how we're going to make the Christmas party work, but also how we, in children's services, we always do a big push on making sure that every vulnerable child that is known to us at least has a good few presents to open. You've probably been aware of some of the sort of work that we've done in the past around, you know, collecting lots of really good presents, wrapping them up, liaising with parents, making sure that children have presents to open. We can't do that in the same way this year, so we're planning to do it through some sort of voucher arrangements and opening up a donations account. So watch this space for that. We've still got to work at the keeping our workforce resilient, upbeat and positive, and able to do the job that we're asking them to do, and that is no mean feat. Picking up what we've learned so far about how we operate in these conditions, but also how we take some of the real positives forward. So Rebecca was talking about the advice line to parents. That has been such a success for us, and enabled us to make such a coherent sort of approach to our more vulnerable families right from early stages of vulnerability. And that's certainly one of the legacies that we would like to continue doing. Some of our blended approaches now, bearing in mind that good engagement that we have with some young people, some families, we wouldn't stop that now. And some of the level of connectivity that teams are feeling at one level, we would certainly keep on working with. Because, you know, through all this, we've had to keep striving towards our kind of aspirations as a service, around good practice, around the values that drive the service, around the culture and engagement that there is across the service. And we certainly don't want to lose that. So, you know, thinking about the future and how we maintain that, given that we'll be within this sort of restricted working for some good foreseeable time to come, is one of the things that we will continue to keep thinking about. And I think that is it. So I shall stop sharing the screen now. Shall I, Chair?
Yes, please, Jane. And Jane and Rebecca, and thank you very much, you know, for that very comprehensive, you know, presentation, and for all, you know, for all the work that you have done through the pandemic period, and obviously continue to do. We go now to sort of questions and comments, and you know, we're going to go on a hands up basis. I can see that Councillor Martin Croker's got his virtual hand up, so we go to Councillor Croker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. My name is Martin Croker. I'm a member of this committee, and I'm the councillor for the Lansdowne ward in Abergavenny. Firstly, Jane and Rebecca, if I could echo the Chair's comments, I think you've done a tremendous job in keeping services running. And if you could pass on the thanks, I'm sure, from the whole committee to all those who've been at the front line. It's been tremendous. This morning, I was somewhat horrified to hear on the news that 2 weeks ago, the SAGE committee meeting in London recommended that there should have been another lockdown, and that the politicians in London ignored that. I think we might well be preparing for another major escalation in COVID-19. And looking at that tremendous report you've just presented to us, I've got 4 questions, if that's all right, that really I'm sort of looking to lessons that we might have learned, and you've alluded in your presentation, both of you, I think, to issues around this, and it's really looking forward if we do get overwhelmed by a second wave, and fingers crossed that we don't, but I have to say it's looking increasingly ominous, I think. The first is around child protection, child safety. And it was great to see that in your report that services remain fully operational and no drop off in referrals. But during the school's lockdown, I would have thought that there would have been an impact in the fact that schools were not making referrals to your teams, because again, I would have thought that would have been a major way in which children arriving at school might have alerted school staff to a potential difficulty with school. Where were the sort of referrals coming from? And I've seen the figures for domestic violence, and police forces saying there had been a big increase in violence in the home. And I was wondering where we could get evidence of whether that was happening within homes, with the link with schools broken and so on, if we lock down again. The second question is around supervised parental meetings. And it was lovely to hear the way that you tried to manage that, where children want to see the parent who they don't normally see. I'm concerned that going forward, we would obviously, if that process continues and there were face-to-face meetings, we would have 2 families meeting together with the risk of spreading the virus. But if we went back to virtual meetings, we're going to be talking later on in another report to this committee about resilience, whether that would actually be a really severe blow to youngsters who, after a gap, started seeing the estranged parent again, only be told now that, I'm sorry, you can't, we've got to go back to lockdown, and what you might be able to do to mitigate that. The third thing that I was interested in looking at your presentation is around the social and emotional pressure on your staff. And again, you've alluded to this, but I'm interested in how many of your staff were regarded as vulnerable and needed to isolate themselves, and also about the pressure of absence rates as a result of pressure of working in the way that your colleagues have had to do, and whether, as an authority, there's anything we can do to support that. Or whether staff, having survived the first wave, might actually find a second wave almost a step too far. And my final question really comes from that, and I'd like you to generally just reflect on how serious a second lockdown would be for the county from the perspective of your services. Sorry, there's quite a lot there, but thank you very much indeed. Look forward to your comments.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Croker. Jane, do you want to start, or?
Yeah, I'll do my best to work through. The first area of question was around child protection referrals, and wondering about, you know, whether we were picking up all the child protection concerns, particularly during the time when the school was off. And I did make the comment in the presentation that our referral rate didn't significantly drop, and much of those referrals were from the police, usually concerning domestic abuse. They were also some self-referrals from parents themselves struggling with the issues that were affecting their family during this period. And also, I think because we had that, as we were describing it, you know, our early help provision didn't stop. So even our school-based counselling didn't stop. All our early help work, so the panels. So although we weren't maybe getting the referral directly straight off into children's services, we had that open communication with all our early help and support services, so that when things were emerging, we could have that sort of referral in and sort of step up, step down sort of situation. So although we weren't getting referrals directly from schools, issues within families and communities, they come to light. School is a significant referrer for us, but it's not our only big referrer. And our other big referrers being health and police, we continue to get referrals from them, as well as children and families being seen in other ways during this scene. I use in inverted commas, in other ways. So I couldn't say to you, yeah, we definitely picked up every issue, because no children's services is ever going to say that. But, you know, we feel that we were picking up issues, and where real vulnerabilities were, you know, they tend to come up in other ways. We're not just waiting for a school to refer. When schools did come back, we did see a steady increase, but again, strangely enough, of course, we were getting referrals from schools, but again, it was the police referrals that were sort of our biggest, sharpest incline of referring sources. Related to that, obviously, was the question about domestic abuse, and you know, almost goes without saying that there's, whilst we understand some of domestic abuse vulnerability within our families and communities, we don't get to it all. And the more we can kind of create conditions whereby children and young people can share what's going on at home through some of the services provided by Rebecca's teams, the more that we can sort of try to tackle those issues early on. And you know, like I said before, the level of police referrals hasn't gone up, hasn't declined at all. In fact, it's gone up, and the majority of the police referrals that we get concern domestic abuse. Should I pause there and just see if there's anything, or should I crack on through the questions?
Yes, I'd push on now, because sort of time is a little bit.
With the other area of questioning was around supervised parental meetings, how we manage that if we go into a second phase of lockdown. One of the things that we've been really clear to do is to not switch off completely digital. We've continued to offer the sort of both approaches, and one of the rationale for that was the fact that if we then have to go back into a complete lockdown, children aren't sort of completely wrong-footed about it, that it just then one bit stops, but we carry on with the other bit. So we couldn't anyway as a service, because of the level of sort of risk assessment that we're having to do and the risk management that we're having to do to enable direct contact to happen. So if we do go into a lockdown again, a complete lockdown again, those virtual means are already set up, they're already happening, they haven't stopped, so we just up them again. But yes, without a doubt, it would still have an impact on children who are wanting to see their parents that they don't live with. Our contact centres, family time centres, have been in detail risk assessed, and the management that goes on in terms of how children and families are playing with toys, bringing their own toys, the cleaning regime, the sort of the ins and outs, the temperature checking of parents before they come in, is all in place. So where we can still have face-to-face, we're confident that our risk assessments are in place, and if you know, steps have been put in correctly. You're absolutely right. couldn't echo more about the pressures that's been on staff, the social and emotional pressures that's been, and we're doing, you know, we continue to do where we can, whatever we can, to support the resilience of staff. It is very daunting going into this phase. We sort of had we're all in it together, the sort of adrenaline rush of the first period, sort of approaching a second period. It is a different sort of feel within the service. We're very recognising of that. Our absent rates, fortunately, and touch wood, have our sickness absent rates over this period have not been to the extent where it's having a real impact on the service. In fact, our sickness rates over this time have been remarkably good. There certainly have been individuals within the service that have had to shield or have been in households where other people are shielding, and we have worked carefully with those individuals, risk assessing them on that individual basis to see where they what they can do. And many of those people were able to continue to work from home right throughout this period and still continue to do so. We've got quite detailed data within children's services about, you know, who was shielding, who was working from home, who was off, who was on leave, and all the rest of it right over this period, because of course it was one of the things that we were aware of. We'd have to monitor closely in case we got to critical levels of staff problems, staff shortages. So overall, reflecting on, you know, how serious a second lockdown would be, well, it's so difficult to say, isn't it? Nobody wants it, but if we're more ready for it now than we were right at the beginning. We've done so much to sort of make ourselves operational. We understand some of the challenges better. We understand some of what we can do to alleviate those challenges better. We'd be desperately worried about the impact on families, and that would certainly have that ripple effect right across the service. This for families is, I think I said in the presentation, it's not just now, it's how this is going to affect families and the children and young people, especially their emotional welfare over the longer term, that we're very, very aware of. I hope I sort of rattled through them.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I think, you know, good sort of comprehensive answers there. Go to Councillor Joanne Watkins now, who has her hand raised.
Thank you very much. And yes, once again, my great appreciation for the amount of work that you guys have put in. It was brilliant to hear in particular about how you managed to keep up the online work, the circle of security, the non-violent resistance groups. That's brilliant. And the online counselling as well. I know many, many young people was really struggling with their mental health during this time, and to hear that the amount of things that you put in place and kept going, that's wonderful. Two aspects, if I may. I've been running Caldecott Food Bank for the duration of the crisis, so I know that we've been working much more closely with council services during that time, and that that there was a very good communication between the food bank and the services. Are you hoping to keep that going? Basically, are we hoping to keep that partnership going and to make sure that those things can carry on? From the food bank side of things, so I'm assuming it was really useful from child services as well. And then the other one is, you said that the referral rate had gone up, and Jane, you elaborated a little bit in relation to Martin's question. Do we have a particular idea of what the causes are? Are there particular things that are causing pressures into families now? Are the particular aspects of the societal aspects? Are there particular COVID related aspects? What is there something there that needs to be dealt with in a bigger level, or is it just going to be, is it more of the same, really? So thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Rebecca, do you want to respond to you might be able to respond to both, but
yeah, I could do that, Jane. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Hi, Joanna. Yeah, in terms of the Caldecott Food Bank, absolutely is the answer to that. And we're already having some conversations with our colleagues who were running the food banks and doing that community work about how we can continue that work on, because absolutely we've started this now, so we need to continue that. And we're also looking about how we bring in third sector as well to make more of a wider community approach and link up as well for our families, which I think is the next step. And we're absolutely in the right place now to think about how we then add to that to give our families and young people a richer experience of not only the support they get from children's service, but a community as a wider thing. So yeah, that is very much high on our agenda, and we're kind of doing that consultation bit at the moment with families that have received that service and what the benefits of that have been. And we're also doing a survey through our early help panel about some of those things as well with families and young people and their experiences of that, to make sure that our intentions were received in the same way by the families, and also to kind of iron out any kinks in terms of things that weren't working. And we had to be really careful as well around that work, around consent. So being really transparent to families about the sharing of information between the teams and between the individuals and professionals. So as well, it'd be really helpful to speak to our families about that as well, and how we might continue that transparency to make sure we don't lose that, because actually that's a really key part of it in giving that support, is making sure that they know we are having those discussions. And then in terms of the themes, I think there's been escalation of family dynamics due to the pressures of COVID. That's absolutely been a feature, really. So because people have been in lockdown, that, you know, normal kind of family dynamic relationship issues that have been present maybe before have then escalated as a result of the pressure of lockdown. Some of the issues have been around financial issues, and also that escalating the family dynamics. And then another big feature for young people and children has been anxiety around this COVID pandemic and the lack of an ending, the lack of it finishing. So that kind of open end, like not really sure where we are. And that bringing up of feelings around grief and loss as well, you know, them losing their year in school, them losing their activities with friends, and then also kind of on a bigger scale when they have deaths in the family. So we've been working really hard around, you know, kind of working around grief and loss, and around how to accept that and how to manage that within a family setting, because obviously that is very much around not only in the families but as a wider thing as well. And in line with that, our remembering event that we do every Christmas, usually at Caldicott Castle, around grief and loss, we're going to look at doing that virtually this year, and I think that would be slightly different to our normal approach, given that actually grief and loss is a much bigger thing than death at this moment in time. Is way bigger than that, because it's all around kind of, you know, larger things than just death as well. Does that answer your question?
I just very briefly, I'll just add in, that's absolutely right, Rebecca. Add in a couple of themes that we're really keeping an eye on as well. Is the online exploitation, both criminal and sexual, for our children and young people, as well as substance and alcohol misuse. And parental mental health. So these are, I mean, it's all a bit circular, isn't it? It's like what you know, but I think that COVID is having an impact on all of those areas that both Rebecca and I've alluded to.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Joanna. Any other question issues? Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I wanted to repeat the same as other members have said, you know, thank you for all the hard work of your staff, and obviously it's been a very challenging time in terms of adapting to the different methods of working. There do seem to be some positive aspects, though. I mean, for example, linking with the food banks and so forth. I was just wondering about the additional learning needs children, you know, with autism and so forth, because we don't have the same contact with schools now. We don't have any special needs school based actually in Monmouthshire, with the closing down of Mountain House School. And although Action for Children deal with some of the children referrals, for example, at the Headlands Penarth School, there are other pupils who go to, you know, private schools, either within, there's one at Monmouth, for example, or outside of county, for example. I know somebody who has a child with autism and heads towards a school in the Bristol area, and I just wondered how they were contacted and what support they got, because I should imagine, I think with autism you like to keep to a routine, and I think it must be quite stressful for the families not to have that routine that's available normally. And so it was really just concentrating on that particular aspect, and whether there are I mean, obviously there are always gaps in the service. The other point that I'd want to make was that although you can conduct virtual meetings, and I should think one of the advantages in terms of saving travel time, in terms of that positive aspect, but I'm just wondering whether you can get the same emotional support as you get with face-to-face contacts, and that particular concern, because I don't think there isn't the same sort of availability. And you've mentioned about adaptability with regard to meetings in gardens and so forth. Well, as the winter gets on, that might be a little less practical. So there's a few questions mixed in there, but I mean, I suppose it's really about the gaps possibly that are in relation to schools out of county that not necessarily are for Action for Children. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brown. Jane?
So in terms of the support for children with disabilities, indeed, yes, they were some of our more vulnerable children during this period. Not all of them, like you say, Councillor Brown, could attend their school, certainly during the lockdown period. With that, I mean, our role within children's services around children with disabilities is to provide respite and support. We did that through our Action for Children Disability Support Service. So they were often going, for some of our most vulnerable children during this period, they were actually spending quite a number of hours each day with the child to provide respite for the family and to try and keep the child into some sort of routine. I think I mentioned also that we had our day respite service, not overnights, but where a child could go during the day, not on occasions, and parents had their direct payments that they continued to utilise during the period. So although we can't ever replace a school or what a child would get through school, we can provide, where we need to, additional support. I can see actually just Will perhaps is wanting to come in there.
All right, sorry, yeah.
He might have a better answer than me.
Yeah, Will, do you want to come in there, please? Sorry, I just didn't see your hand down at the bottom.
Not at all, not at all. Good morning, everybody. Will McLean, Chief Officer for Children and Young People in Monmouthshire. I think all I would say, Councillor Brown, is that there was huge amounts of really positive work between CYP colleagues and those in social services throughout the period of lockdown to make sure that we were aware of all of the children who might need extra support, to make sure those children who were vulnerable could access school, could access learning. And of course, Mountain House was actually open throughout that period of time. So Mountain House was providing support and education and learning to those children throughout that period. There are a number of children who we support, often in conjunction with social services, who have to go to schools out of county. And those children either were able to continue, in some cases were able to continue attending school, which was really positive where that was possible. But if not, we were working closely with the schools to make sure that they continued their engagement with the children. And our expectation of our out of county schools is no different to our expectations of our in-county schools. So I think it's important to remember that actually Mountain House was, a school in existence throughout lockdown, and it was children. As we look forward now, we're looking to make sure that all of our children, wherever they're placed, and all of our educational settings are as prepared as they can be for whatever might come down the road in terms of future restrictions on attendance. So I hope that helps in some way, but I know we're going to come on to talk about kind of education a little bit later.
Okay, thank you, Will. Thanks for that. Any other questions or issues on this topic? In terms of summing up, and I'll come on to thanks in a minute, but in terms of summing up, obviously grateful now for and reassured as a committee, I'm sure, in terms of the report that we've had, both from Jane Rogers, who's head of service, and Rebecca Stanton, who was in with her. The fact that the service responded quickly in a very difficult situation, and certainly for if you look at CYP, if you look at school situation, they also responded well in quite a short space of time. But certainly child services more difficult in some respects to be able to give that sort of 24-hour support. And certainly we've had quite a comprehensive report on how it's been done, both virtually and also increasingly in person. I'm grateful for the questions that have been answered in terms of the issue of violence within the home, and obviously that being directed not just at partners but at children, and that is a major concern of the committee, and certainly a major concern that I've had during the lockdown, listening to the news, and that you have continued to be able to pick up the children who are at risk and the families who are at risk, and to be able to put in that support to help them during these very challenging time. I was glad to hear the strategies that you had in terms of providing social and emotional support for your staff as well, because obviously quite a very difficult time to work both virtually and then increasingly in person. And obviously that you reflected on the seriousness of the situation. We had questions on referrals, perhaps not coming from school, but you reassured us there by saying that referrals continue to come via the police service and also from self-referrals. And obviously as schools became more established after the initial lockdown, that they then could refer children to you. The fact that you didn't have a huge level of absence of staff, I think that is reassuring, and the fact that you worked in partnership organisations, as Councillor Joe Watkins picked up on, food banks and so on. So we're grateful for that, and certainly the links with children with special additional needs who might be in other institutions in Penarth or elsewhere, that those links were obviously kept, as Will McLean outlined. I'd certainly like to say once again, thank you very much for the input this morning, but primarily as well, thank you for all your work that you've put in during this very challenging time, and that of your staff. And we all know that it is ongoing, it hasn't ended. I think, as Churchill said about one battle, that it wasn't even the beginning of the end, really. We're still very much in the middle of it, and obviously I hear this as well from being on the corporate parenting panel, and I am reassured by the work that you do. So thank you very much, diolch yn fawr, and thanks for your input this morning. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on now then. And I'll move to the item agenda 7, which is the school-based support for emotional well-being. And I don't know, Will, whether you want to introduce this.
Sorry, Chair. Yes, of course. I won't say very much, but just to introduce two colleagues, Moana Wagstaff and Lucy Doyle, who are two principal educational psychologists. And they're just going to talk to you about the work that they've been doing with the schools to make sure that our children are as well supported in their school settings as they can be. I think this is a really important part that links, that universal engagement with schools that children experience, that more acute support work, which has just been described so clearly by Jane and Becky. So I hope this is a really useful presentation for the committee.
Thanks, Will.
Good morning, everybody. Just to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Morwenna Wagstaff.
And I am Dr. Lucy Doyle. I'm just going to share the presentation with you and hope that it is visible. Oh, I've lost you. Sorry, I'm just.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Sharing. Everybody see that presentation?
Yes, yeah, that's fine.
I've lost everybody, but I'll just move that.
Yeah, it's come up.
Hi, yes, I'm Dr. Lucy Doyle. Morwenna and I are the joint principal educational psychologists and wellbeing leads. And today we're going to give you a flavour of some of the work that we've been doing to support vulnerable children and young people during the pandemic in Monmouthshire. So thank you for having us today. So I'm going to give you a quick, brief overview of the team and the context of our. We currently have 7 EPs who work mostly part-time. We're lucky enough to have a trainee, a third-year trainee from the Cardiff doctoral course with us this year. We have a member of our team on maternity leave, and we're currently working under capacity due to the national EP recruitment difficulties. So to give you an idea about some of the work that we do and how we work, as EPs, we work to support the development, wellbeing, resilience and learning of children and young people. So we're person-centred in our approach, and we work with professionals and those closest to children to achieve the best possible outcomes. So a large focus of the work we do is to support and develop the skills of others to identify and meet the needs of children and young people and to promote an inclusive approach. So our work can be focused at the individual level, the school setting level and at a systemic level. So the PEP in the wellbeing role is new to Monmouthshire, and Morwenna and I took up these posts in September 2019, so we still feel that the leadership roles is fairly new to us. The academic year of 2019-20 presented many challenges for everybody, but for us it started with the Eston inspection, the sudden death of a much loved and valued ALN colleague, and a number of critical incidents in our schools. And then of course came COVID and the current pandemic situation, which continues. Of course, with challenges comes opportunities, and like everyone, this time has been a great test of personal and professional resilience and adaptability.
So, as was the case for everybody, going into lockdown in March was a shock, and everyone shared feelings of disbelief and concern about how we would continue during the most unprecedented and unfamiliar situations. The priority quickly became to ensure that the school-based hubs that were created across Monmouthshire in line with Welsh Government guidance were functional, and that the children and young people attending them were well supported during these strange times. The level of logistics and coordination for this to happen was immense, and we saw some really positive collaboration between school staff and the professionals across the Children Young People Directorate and social care. Direct role in the weekly vulnerable people panels that Jane previously mentioned, actually, alongside colleagues from within our directorate and social care, to ensure that the most vulnerable children and young people were identified and provided with suitable support during the lockdown period. Risk assessments and careful consideration of the factors associated with ensuring physical safety, as well as the emotional health and well-being of children, young people and their families, shaped these conversations to help make decisions about whether children and young people attending school-based hubs was the best thing, considering the risk posed by COVID. Sometimes the need was to provide respite in a school-based hub for where the child's needs were really complex and demanding, so as to protect fragile home placements and environments. Supporting schools to ensure that they were able to connect with families of vulnerable children and young people who were remaining at home during lockdown was also a focus, with offers of resources, support, advice for staff and where appropriate families. Schools were communicating with children and young people and their families throughout the school closures, and for those considered vulnerable, this contact was particularly important. We know that schools attempted to maintain regular contact throughout the period of the school closures. Can you flick it along, Lise? Thank you. So obviously during, oh, sorry, Lucy, can you click the slide along?
All right, should have gone down one. Go.
Thank you. Oh, that's great, thanks. So obviously during lockdown, as we've already heard described by social care, the way of working and our typical models of service delivery went out the window. The EPS in particular it's typically a service where we spend much of our time in schools and settings, working with school staff, professionals and families to support children and young people with complex needs. We suddenly became unable to do this and had to quickly develop new ways of working. We had to learn how to communicate effectively with others using new technology, such as MS Teams, which was previously unheard of. And there were initial practical challenges around IT and accessibility. But as these were ironed out, our confidence skills had to develop rapidly in order to respond to the needs of children, young people, schools and settings. We had to learn how to be accessible and available without being able to be physically present. We had to ensure that the school-based hubs knew how to access support for children, young people and staff who could either be accessing the school-based hubs or remaining at home. Initially, during lockdown, we were ensuring daily contact with the school-based hubs to clarify the direct support available. Also, during the lockdown period, there were a multitude of resources being created for children, young people, schools and families from many different sources across the country. We attempted to field some of this, adapt it, develop and share useful resources in an attempt to keep everyone well informed and to minimise information overload. We created a web page at this time to support the sharing of some of these resources during the lockdown period.
Okay, so the return to school, so the summer term. So I'll talk a bit about what we did at that point. So we supported our schools to prepare for the catch-up sessions that they had in the summer term. So the purpose of those was to promote the emotional well-being of all children, including those identified as being vulnerable, those with ALN, those who may have experienced a particularly difficult time during lockdown, and those having difficulty transitioning back into school after such a long period away. So it's important to consider that all children have a unique profile of strengths and needs and would have had a really different experience during lockdown, which impacted on their and their family's resilience. So the idea of being in the same storm but in different boats. And it perhaps be some of the children we wouldn't imagine that would have been having the most difficult time at home. So the main message to our schools was to take a person-centred approach to think about individual pupil needs. A document was created in response to the Welsh Government's operational guidance for schools to support vulnerable groups, including those with ALN, back into school. So this document acknowledged that some learners would be likely to have difficulty following rules around social distancing and hygiene, particularly in all different contexts, and that would be likely to be true of our younger children and those with ALN who may habitually seek physical contact with others. So we focused on understanding the communicative function behind children's behaviours and to help our schools to do that, to think about the need which may be presenting itself and how staff could fulfil those needs in light of the current measures and restrictions. We produced a document for school, quite a lengthy document, around transition, recovery and learning in the aftermath of a pandemic. So this really focused, the first part of that really thought about the well-being of teachers and of teaching staff. So the idea that in order to help others, we need to help ourselves, that oxygen mask idea. It focused on how staff could support each other and what support systems they could put in place in schools. And then it really thought about how staff could create resilient and well-being focused classrooms. So where the staff would create and convey a sense of safety, a sense of calm, a sense of self and collective efficacy, where work to promote social connectedness, which isn't always easy, and the current restrictions and schools working in bubbles, and about promoting hope and optimism, which can be really powerful. Okay, so we put a strong emphasis on prioritising relationships as a way for everyone to recover from the lockdown and support resilience in the ongoing pandemic. So it was vitally important to think about a reconnection and not just re-engagement, but emotional re-engagement phase, with a strong emphasis on the relational approaches to learning. So we know that pupils don't learn effectively if they're not feeling a sense of belonging and safety in their relationships around them. So it really puts teachers and teaching staff at the heart of any interventions and any work we're doing around transitioning children back into school. So thinking about the well-being of not just our children, but on the wider school community, pupils, staff and parents. We shared resources that promoted relationships as an intervention and as a primary mechanism for supporting recovery from adversity. So, you know, we recover from traumatic and difficult events within the context of our relationships. So we developed some training and resources, some of which we collaborated with Gwent Community Psychology Service, and that was really effective. And we came up with some training that would help our schools think about approaches, strategies, interventions of value to all children and young people to support their emotional recovery back into school. There's a strong emphasis on focusing on some of those vulnerable groups, those children that we know would have experienced more difficult times, but also being vigilant to all of our children and young people. As I said earlier, there'll be some children who you may least expect to have had difficulties, and so being vigilant for all of the children in our schools. So we recognise the importance of training, supporting our school-based staff, and we've always delivered training to our schools, but obviously we had to adapt of working safely and not being able to be in our schools as we usually are. So during all of the work we were carrying out, we developed a online training portal in collaboration with supportive colleagues, the digital team in Monmouthshire. That's now been launched, and it includes training and resources for school-based staff. So during the initial re-engagement period, we delivered some online training. Over 70 of our school-based staff attended that training with some really positive evaluations of that. That one was around reconnecting after a pandemic, and that's on our online training portal. So all of the training we now deliver as a live event is available on our training portal, and staff can watch that at a time that's useful to them, at any time that's good for them. We've also recently delivered another second set of training with Gwent Community Psychology Service around developing and promoting resilience in our children in our schools. Okay,
thank you. So as we move into a period of acceptance that this pandemic is going to be inevitably with us for some time to come, we therefore need to create a new normal going forward. This means that we're continually reflecting on how we can deliver services to ensure that we maximise the benefits of new ways of working, whilst continuing to develop and shape the EPS service in particular in response to the needs of schools and children and young people, and in particular our vulnerable learners. It has been an extremely busy term for the EPS so far, and throughout the lockdown period, and with a focus on high numbers of complex cases which involve our most vulnerable children and young people in Monmouthshire. This involves us working closely with colleagues within the CYP Directorate and especially ALN, as well as schools, families and other professionals, whilst working under the restrictions of COVID. The role of the EP in statutory work for children with ALN has continued throughout this period, with some requests for statutory assessment being delayed or postponed in the very early stages of school closures. We continue to produce psychological advice for statutory assessments for the most vulnerable children and young people in Monmouthshire. It's important that we continue to support schools to prioritise the most vulnerable children and young people for more targeted input from the EPS, and that we continue to evolve to work differently to ensure that schools and settings feel supported. We are maximising the new ways of working around family settings and schools to ensure new ways of working remotely and via Teams, and visiting schools and settings where necessary. We continue to focus on early intervention and follow processes that have developed across the early years. The focus here tends to be on those preschool children with complex needs, and our aim is to develop positive relationships and networks around families, settings and schools to ensure early intervention and collaboration. Working in a way that has a positive impact on high volumes of learners can be achieved, as Lucy said, through training, building capacity, development of staff, who in turn support the children and young people in schools and settings. It is important that our vulnerable children and young people have well-trained staff who are familiar and accessible to them. So ensuring that support for children and young people is grounded in psychological understanding, which emphasises the importance of relationships with trusted adults closest to them. Throughout the pandemic, as Lucia says, we have offered virtual training at times, and where possible, this has been offered as a live event, but can also be accessed by school staff via our new training portal, the screen of which represents the front page of that at any time afterwards. Early feedback on this is positive, so we're grateful for that. Can you click me on? Thanks, Liz. You know, the ongoing picture, we're continually trying to understand what our schools' needs are, and obviously the current focus is well-being. This fits beautifully with the newly developed role of the Wellbeing Lead that myself and Lucy took on in September, and the strategic work that had already started and continues within Monmouthshire, cross-directorate and regionally since the beginning of that role. For example, around the CAMS transformation work, which Becky's team is particularly involved in. At a local level, this involves professional development for school staff to enhance their own well-being in these challenging times, and to promote and develop children's well-being within schools by utilising evidence that's evolving and sharing good practice. It's always been important for us to support the well-being of staff, but this has become even more significant during the pandemic. There is a strong evidence base that staff well-being is closely linked to children and young people's well-being, as well as to their progress and their achievement. Just prior to lockdown, we offered our first pilot staff wellbeing workshop in collaboration with the Healthy Schools Officer, and we've just delivered an adapted version of this online. We are keen to continue to develop our support for school staff, including senior leaders and head teachers. ELSA is an educational psychology-led intervention for promoting the emotional well-being of children and young people. ELSA has been in Monmouthshire since 2016, and we've run 4 5-day initial training courses so far for teaching assistants. We've trained approximately 50 ELSAs, and most of our schools have at least one trained ELSA. ELSAs are understandably in very high demand at the moment, and the quality of school interventions provided by ELSAs support large numbers of children and young people experiencing difficulties quickly and effectively. We're currently linking with the National ELSA Network to work out how the initial training course can be adapted and offered during this pandemic, because there is a real desire from schools in Monmouthshire to have more ELSAs trained. As well as the initial training, we provide ongoing regular group supervision for all our active ELSAs, and obviously that's moved to be done virtually. And we've also just run our first virtual CPD training day for ELSAs, with training videos posted online, which have received over 300 views so far. It was only launched a couple of weeks ago, which is quite interesting. And we've had over 70 evaluations completed so far. The feedback is positive, with ELSAs finding the flexibility to access training at a time best for them helpful. And in terms of impact, ELSAs felt an increased confidence in using these skills and approaches to support children and young people. The EPS are working as part of a cross-directorate group around the development of emotionally based school avoidance training and professional development for schools. EBSA is an umbrella term for children and young people who have severe difficulty in attending school due to emotional factors, often resulting in prolonged absence from school. Development in this area by our team began just prior to lockdown due to an identified local need and the need for preventative work and early intervention. However, since the lockdown has occurred, some evidence is now suggesting a national survey of children and young people that that this should be supported at a local level. So we were sort of, that's been a positive piece of work, because obviously in light of the pandemic, levels of parent and child and young person anxiety has increased. I think that's all that I have to say. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your time, and we're happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Okay, well, thank you, Wagstaff and Dr. Lucy Doyle, for that very comprehensive presentation. And obviously at the time, I can't think that there's been a time like this certainly in our memories, where people need such strong emotional support, both the pupils in school, but also staff as well. It's been a very, very challenging time for everybody. We'll go now to questions, and I've got some hands up. Go first to Councillor Louise Brown.
I don't think I was actually first in the list, but
yeah, the list is not showing with me at the moment, so I'm afraid it's a bit
of
a slight potluck. But could you take the
Councillor
presentation down now as well, please? Thanks.
Sorry, Councillor
that's great.
I think was before me, but do you want to go before me, Councillor Grocott? Or
no, we'll go with you now.
No, I'm more than I was going to say age before beauty, but I wouldn't dare to say that.
Yeah, we'll go with Councillor Louise Brown now.
Careful what you say.
Yeah.
This is being recorded. Yeah, I think I find it a very interesting presentation, and thank you. Are you actually a Gwent-based service, or are you actually a Monmouthshire-based service? And one of the issues I was interested in is obviously, additional learning needs have got different types of conditions that you deal with, and the emotional side is obviously support is important, but obviously there's those with social emotional behaviour disorders, and also you've got autistic children and children who've got dyslexia and various other things. So they all need different approaches, and although the generalist emotional support and trust with adults is important, how do you train teachers in these different areas? Because my understanding is that ELSA is sort of a general training, but not the same as a sort of a specialist special needs type of training, so how do you overcome that? And the second question I've got, obviously we don't have a special needs school in Monmouth, and there are residents whose pupils possibly go to Gloucestershire or to Bristol or to Newport or to other areas. And if you concentrate on the general state schools, how do you ensure that those who are at these private schools and paid for also get the same opportunity to have the same training and support needed for these pupils who are actually resident in Monmouthshire? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brown.
Lucy, shall I start? And then
yeah.
I'll chip in.
So in answer, thank you for your question, Louise. And I think in answer to the first point is we are Monmouthshire Educational Psychology Service, although we are increasingly working at a sort of network level with our regional colleagues, but we belong to Monmouthshire. In terms of, absolutely, I think the focus of this presentation was around sort of supporting vulnerable children and young people, and absolutely we would encompass all of those needs that you described in terms of ALN within that. And I think alongside the work that we've described sort of today, there are many other strands going on to the work that myself and Lucy are involved with regards to the ALN strategy, and in particular a focus on children who have additional learning needs, social communication, autism, difficulties with challenging behaviour and all of those. And I think we are in the process of exploring how training can be delivered And we have within, and I guess in recognition of your second question was around, we don't have a specialist school in Monmouthshire any longer, but we do have 4 special needs resource bases. And so myself and Lucy are part of the special needs resource base network across Monmouthshire, which is bringing together professionals from ALN, our service, and from each of the bases to develop those training and skills around supporting our children with the most complex needs. I think I don't know, I hope I've answered your first question. Lucy, do you have anything to add to that?
No, just that in terms of thinking about those individual children, and you talked about a number of different areas of need, there might be layers to the work that we offer as an EPS. It might be that if it's a fairly complex pupil, that we would engage individually around that child with other professionals and staff and families and the child themselves. So it might be that we work at an individual level, and then we might do work at a school level. So we might identify a particular school. Each school will have a different set of needs and priorities. So if it's felt that a school would benefit from some whole school training around a particular area, you mentioned social emotional difficulties or ASD, then we could facilitate and deliver training to that school as a whole, as well as doing some individual work. It might be that we're working at a systemic level, as Morwenna mentioned, thinking about what we can offer ASD wise across the authority. So I guess there's different levels and layers of work. Hope that makes some sense.
And I think in response to the question you had about children who are attending schools outside of Monmouthshire, once a child has a statement, currently a statement of special educational needs, which is obviously changing with the ALN reform coming in, but currently the statement of special educational needs, we are often involved with those children who attend a school outside the county through our out of county support. And that would be around, getting involved in reviews or updating support. Often those are some of our most complex cases that we work with. And actually, I would say that at the moment we have a high level of work around supporting those children in conjunction with the ALN team and other colleagues across, well, our directorate, but also social care, to ensure that placements are appropriate, that they are, well-trained staff, and they're receiving, the high quality education that we would want for them, despite them not being within Monmouthshire settings and schools. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, sorry, could I just... I think the thing that I was interested in was obviously, they do have statements and they get support via that way. But what I was interested in is obviously, the hubs that you've got are based in the state schools, as opposed, to, for example, we've got 1 or 2 pupils in a Monmouth private special needs school, and we've got them in other different areas. And it was really just to ensure that that you mentioned about the access to the training for the staff in our state schools, and obviously it's easier to deal with that. But I was just talking about whether or not the same support was available to ensure that was available to the Action for Children schools and so forth, like Headlands, and to make sure that not only does the individual pupil get that support, but the school is also getting the same support that they would if there was a local authority special school. Do you see what I'm
yeah, absolutely. And I think, as Lucy said, I guess our service would get involved at an individual level. So if there was an individual training need around a Monmouthshire child in one of those schools, we might get involved. Obviously, if part of that was to deliver some training, we'd be happy to. But I guess, there we go. Will might have a better comment. Thank you, Will.
I think Will wants to come in. I can see a hand up there. Will, do you want to comment?
Just very briefly, I think if the process by which we go through before we place a child in an out of county school is extensive, and clearly Lucy and Morwenna's team will be heavily involved in working with the school, the parents, health professionals to arrive at a diagnosis that leads to a statement of additional learning needs currently within the current framework. We then go through an extensive process by which we commission a place in a special school for that child, if needs be, if we can't meet their needs in one of the special needs resource bases that we have in county. So the whole process is making sure that we find a place for that child who are able to support him or her in the best way that they can. What we then do on an annual basis is review their statement in consultation with the school. So the whole process is around placing that child in the best place. As Moena and Lucy have said, there might be times whereby there might be some specific training that they might need, but the whole purpose of that process is to put them in a school whereby the school is there to provide that support and education for that child. That's the very purpose of it. So it would be slightly odd then for us to be providing significant amount of training into independent special schools, because that's the very thing that we're commissioning in the first instance.
Okay, thanks, Will.
Thank you.
I think we move on now. Just keeping an eye on the time. I think questions now are going to have to be, fairly brief without long statements, because we've got another presentation to do, and it's now 10 to 12. So we go to Councillor Martin Grocott.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Moena and Lucy, for putting together that presentation. I've got 3 points. I think 2 are perhaps for you to answer. The third might be for Will to muse on. The first then is one of your slides. You got a lovely quote about resilience. And I was listening to a programme on the radio about this idea of the resilient child. And I suppose for two centuries, the British Empire was based on children who'd gone to our great public schools to gain resilience for that. But it seems to me that there is quite obvious links between resilience and poverty and deprivation, and the ability to generate resilience in your child if you're a fairly downtrodden parent yourself. And we do have schools around Monmouthshire with high levels of deprivation in their catchment areas. And I was wondering if, as a result of the pressures on families and so on, whether you've been able to target some of those schools where many of those children will be pupils. The second point is that I'm a governor at King Henry VIII. And one of the great things that we've been able to do over the last couple of years is to link with the top year of our primaries in the cluster to share maths teaching. And our specialist maths teachers have gone out and taught in the primaries to try to get over that terrifying leap between your teacher in junior school and your specialist maths teacher when you get to the big school. And it's interesting and concerning that at a recent governor meeting, we heard that the maths department have just retested our year 7s, and when they were teaching them comparing when they were teaching them in their juniors to where they are now, and they have regressed by 6 months. If we go into a further lockdown, which I fear is increasingly a possibility, in your professional opinion, do we risk almost losing a generation of education for our children? And then the third one, and this is for Will to muse on perhaps, and I'm not expecting any more than musing, but one of your slides was headed the ongoing pandemic. And it seems to me from discussion with a couple of our primary school head teachers, and indeed at the school where I was until recently the chair of governors, we parents are giving their children subliminal messages by congregating at school gates, by ignoring all the social distancing rules and so on. And so our schools are giving very positive messages to our youngsters about how they survive and thrive during the pandemic. These are often being totally ignored by their parents and carers at school gates. And it's difficult for head teachers without risking the links with those parents to say, you must not do that at my gate. Is there any way in which the authority can try and intervene as an authority to give parents that message that they are not helping their children? For example, through, I don't know what we officially call them, but the guys who are patrolling our town centres and so on, the COVID monitors. So thank you. Diverse and weird questions.
Okay, thanks. Moena and Lucy, do you want to take the first two? And
yeah.
then, if you will, the third.
Shall I take the first? When you mentioned about the resilience and the importance of that, I guess the important thing about resilience is that it's not fixed. And whilst, like you say, there are lots of children and particular pockets of the authority who are experiencing difficult home lives and lots of and extra risk factors, that actually one of the protective factors is the relationships and the support that children get from schools. So whilst we can't change a lot of those home-based factors, there is a lot that schools can do to develop and build resilience. So we did some training 2 weeks ago that was available for all school staff in all of our schools, where the focus was about developing resilience following the pandemic. And with that, there was lots and lots of resources and materials that schools could go away and follow up. You mentioned there being particular schools that might need more of a focus on that resilience work. And again, if they can access that training and we can deliver more above and beyond that if the need is there. But there was a lot of food for thought in that training that schools found really helpful. So I hope that answers the first question. The second question, Moana, did you have any thoughts about?
Yeah, I was just going to chip in really. And in regards to the first question, I just wanted to reassure you as well that throughout the pandemic and continuing, all of our schools have an identified link EP who is in regular communication to discuss, particular groups of children or young people in their setting who might have particular needs. I'm just relating back to that sort of initial thought around deprivation. I think your point that you've raised about the year 7 and that regression, I think is we all know that's a fear. Children regress anyway during the summer holidays. So actually such a long period of school closures would have had an impact. And I know that we've done a little bit of work with Sharon Randall-Smith, who I believe is on this call as well, around the money from the Welsh Government about the Closing the Gap grant, I want to say. I'm not sure if I'm using the right language, but we've had a little bit of input around that with Sharon, who might want to answer that question a bit more fully than I can at this stage, to look at those, as you say, to hope that we don't lose a generation of learners during this time. I don't know, Sharon, sorry, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, sorry,
okay,
Sharon,
yes,
you want to come in?
Yes, certainly. Good morning, everyone. Sharon Randall-Smith, Head of Service for Children and Young People. Yes, to take on board and continue from what Moana says, we have been working with EPs to look at how we can use some of our funding for accelerated learning provision to support those learners who've moved from year 6 into year 7 that we have identified as being, are struggling a little bit, and where we're seeing a gap closing. So what we've done is looked at how we will support schools in the use of their accelerated learning plan and provision, where they have additional staff to focus particularly on literacy and numeracy to accelerate that progress over the next 6 months and close that gap as much as they can. But in support of that, the work that Moana and Lucy and her team are doing to identify those areas where children are struggling, such as resilience or confidence, where they're anxious, and to support schools in really developing the child holistically and supporting them holistically, rather than just in the one area of literacy and numeracy. Because to be perfectly honest, unless the child is ready to learn, unless the child has that confidence, they're not going to learn as well. You get everything else in place and you can close that gap. And I suppose, when we come to blended learning, we'll be able to talk in a bit more detail about how that approach will support our learners going forward, so that if, the worst happens and we do need to be in and out of school, learning will take place, and good quality learning, wherever that may be.
Okay, thanks. Will, do you want to come in now, or are you happy with the response from Sharon?
I'm entirely happy with the response from Sharon and colleagues then, but just to pick up on Councillor Grocut's last point, yeah, I agree completely in terms of it's so important that our parents model the behaviours that we're expecting children to follow in school every day. And one of the things which I'm acutely aware of is when you cross into a school site, then you are very, very clear about social distancing, where the children have to go, the flows of the school, the way the school manages that. And yet sometimes at the end of the school day and the beginning of the school day, we do see a lot of parents in specific areas. So we are doing some things to try and ease that. So we're looking at road closures in a couple of our schools to help that position. And if they are successful, then we'll roll those out further. I think beyond that, I think it's really I think the importance of the relationship between the head teacher and parents is critical, as you said, Councillor Grocott. But I also think that that's a relationship that is more powerful than me writing to say our parents across the county, because for many people it will just be a kind of a letter that comes home from school from someone they don't know and engage with. But that resonance of that relationship between the head teacher and the parents should help that. But it is something that we've been discussing with heads over the last few meetings we've had. And again, a really useful reminder for us. But I'll take that back and I'll discuss it with some of our enterprise and operations team. And if there's anything further we can do, we'll certainly look to do that.
OK, thanks, Will. Go now then to Councillor Joe Watkins.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation and the work that you all do. I know from experience that it's great stuff. So I wanted just to clarify something. You talked about the work the educational psychology team are doing and that you're carrying on. How are you actually managing to do that? Are you having to do everything remotely? I know from my own children that in primary school age children in particular, they don't necessarily always respond that well, and I know it's like going to classrooms and do observations. And how are you actually managing to do your work with the COVID restrictions? And also that follows on to how we are using ELSAs as well, because obviously most of our schools are working in bubbles. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. How are the ELSAs actually managing to go in without breaking those bubbles at the time? So can you give me some clarification as to how we're actually managing to fulfill this work within the COVID restrictions?
Yeah, shall I go for it, Lucy, to start? So the first question, as we alluded to, it's been an interesting time. We have been and we are still going into schools and settings where it is essential, and that's based on the sort of Welsh Government's guidance. That is a little bit woolly, and what we take is always a person-centred approach around that, to look at the individual circumstances around that child or young person. So in some instances, parents are perfectly capable, for example, of participating in a virtual Teams meeting with other professionals, and that has been quite positive. But in some instances, it is far more appropriate and necessary for us to have had those meetings in schools, in line with our own risk assessments and the school's risk assessments around sort of keeping everybody safe and social distancing. So really a combination. We are trying to do as much of our work as possible online, and actually our schools and professionals have been fantastic in taking that up and engaging, and actually parents as well. So as much as possible we're trying to do remotely over the telephone and all of that, but we are still available to go into schools in line with our risk assessment, in line with the needs of that individual pupil and that set of circumstances. And we are, you know, obviously mitigating the risks, and sometimes the risks of us going in are far less than the risks to that child if a placement breaks down or something like that, for example. So it's very much on an individual level we're looking at those. Lucy, have you got anything to add to that before I launch into it?
Yeah, no, you've covered it. I've got a range
in regards to ELSA, really, it's really interesting you raise that, because it depends on individual schools and how they're using their ELSAs. Some of our schools have one ELSA, some of our schools have multiple ELSAs. There is a real demand and a need from our schools at the moment to have more ELSAs trained, and we are really working with the national network around how that can be done, because obviously it's usually done face to face. Some schools are managing their ELSAs within bubbles, so I know that the ELSAs will remain within the bubble, I guess, over a period of time, and then perhaps move between bubbles. I'm not sure how Will might know a little bit more, but I know in other schools that has been an issue, and that's why they want more ELSAs, so that they could have an ELSA almost assigned to the different bubbles within their settings. Lucy, have you got anything to add to that?
No, some of our schools have plazas, don't they? So for some schools, their bubble is bigger, so they'd love, what they really want to work towards is an ELSA in each plaza, so they're covering the whole school. But yeah, each school's got their own risk assessment, and so that will impact on how they use their ELSAs.
Okay.
So in great demand at the moment.
Okay, thank you both for answering those questions. Can't see any other hands up now, so in terms of summing up, I mean, obviously, thank you first and foremost for giving the presentation, giving your time this morning, and obviously the work that's ongoing. within the authority and within school. And it's picking up on some of the issues, obviously the fact that you are supporting vulnerable learners, and the 4 special needs spaces are obviously important in terms of that. And also the fact that children with statements, whether they're in a maintained setting or in a private setting, that obviously you are involved with those pupils and giving them support. Interesting questions on resilience. It's a very difficult concept, I would argue, not that I'm a trained psychologist, but resilience is such a strange sort of trait, really, which some people appear to have. Whether you're born with it, you learn it, is a good question. But undoubtedly, resilience at the moment, both for staff and for pupils, is very important, because if staff are not resilient, then they are not going to be able to pass that on to their pupils. And I think that is a key factor at the moment, as the pandemic is with us for at least a good few months, possibly over a year, and so it's becoming the new normal. The links certainly between primary and secondary are important, and the fact that sometimes children seem to regress to a certain extent, and I think there's probably more of a danger of that at the moment, because they missed out their year 6. The end of year 6 just went, and although they had blended learning, it's not quite the same as being in school. Glad to hear of ongoing support during the pandemic. The issue of parents congregating, I'm the governor at Ysgol Gymraeg Efenni, the Welsh school, and it's been an issue there, and the head has been very good at tackling it, but it is a major problem, and I hope that the authority will consider road closures in terms of keeping staff and pupils and parents safe. And then the last question about ELSA, etc. Again, I'm glad that work is ongoing, and that is very important, and at times that it is actually taking part, that some of the support is actually physical and within school, and I fully appreciate that is very difficult. And it's all right for us to say in a committee, but we have to think of it from the point of view of your staff, but also teaching staff as well, who are frontline, and they are in school. They're not on teams, they're actually in the classroom, or they're out on the school gate. So, I appreciate what the schools have done. But thank you very much for your time today. Thanks for the presentation. It's been enlightening and very helpful, particularly sort of linking in with the presentation that Jane Rogers and Rebecca Stanton gave. It's good to see the two areas being looked at. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item 8, and I think, is it Sharon Randall-Smith, are you going to lead on this? We're now going to look at blended learning in schools. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, really, this sort of completes the sort of flow of today, really, because our blended learning is set very much within the context of well-being and how it's being developed in our schools, to ensure that we make sure that our schools, our teachers and our pupils, and their well-being is high, so maximise the benefits that they have as they're working through their approaches to delivering the curriculum in a different way. So blended learning is an approach in how we deliver our curriculum, and it's a mix of that face-to-face learning and that sort of distance learning that we've been developing since schools closed in March. Really, that would include, digital technology, but not necessarily. So it's quite a broad way in which we can deliver our learning offer. And this integrated approach is really helpful in us preparing to deliver the new curriculum for Wales when it comes in. So whilst this isn't an ideal time necessarily, it has accelerated that progress within our schools. And just to say that there isn't one right or wrong way of delivering blended learning, or one that's better than another, only really one where the mix of face-to-face and distance learning reflects the context of the school and also, more importantly, the needs of the learners. So it would be fair to say that right at the start of school closure, our schools were at different positions and different places in their capacity to be able to deliver a distance and then to develop a blended learning offer. However, over the summer term, schools have worked hard to do this. And whilst they are all still at different stages of the journey, they are actually moving forward together. So the report that is in front of you has summarised our current position up to date. As you will see, it doesn't say that we are where we need to be, and it looks at where we need to go to next. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Thanks for that that update. Any hands up now then in terms of, yes, Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the report, Sharon. Coming from that, really, I was looking at some research the other day that's been produced by the National Foundation for Education Research, NFER, on the effectiveness of learning at home and looking at provision around the UK. And Wales came bottom in terms of the effectiveness of homeschooling provision. Somebody's got to come bottom, I know, but if we go back into lockdown, which hopefully we won't, is anything being done to make sure we don't come bottom again? And has anybody actually looked at that NFER research to find out why Wales came bottom?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Grocott.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Grocott. I can't say that I've seen that research yet, but I have done an awful lot of other research online that longitudinal studies are showing over time that there is not as great a difference between learning face-to-face and distance learning as was originally thought. However, what is key to this is what quality of learning you are experiencing as a learner, and as always, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's distance learning, the impact and the effectiveness will be on the quality of the teaching. So in order to support that, since lockdown, EAS have supported our schools tremendously by providing a lot of advice and research, access to research, a whole range of professional learning, including just the general skills that teachers and teaching assistants need to be able to develop and deliver an effective blended learning offer, but also then how to audit their skills, to look at what goes forward, what they need to do going forward, what blended learning looks like, what good distance learning looks like, and also have maintained that sort of professional learning to support that. Our teaching assistants in one of our schools have been heavily engaged in that, and they are now disseminating that across other local clusters as well. So there is quite a lot of work and support that has gone on, and there is a lot of work and support that will continue to go on as we try to get that balance. In addition, the region are looking at developing a quality assurance toolkit, which will help schools themselves to be able to identify where their strengths and where they need to go, the next steps are, but also will be able to evaluate what that quality begins to look like. We've met with our schools, and we've talked about that time frame and that development of quality going forward, as we would if we were in a class, so that will give us will help schools improve that offer. And I do hope that Wales won't be at the bottom of that list again. But I'm sure, I would say certainly in our region, we have made much greater strides towards determining what that quality looks like compared to maybe other regions.
Okay, Will, do you want to come in?
Yeah, if I could just very briefly, just to completely echo everything Sharon said, really. I think I did see one piece of research last week by the Education Policy Institute, and that picked up, I think, in terms of Wales's hours that were the amount that was contacted over the pandemic period or the lockdown period. I think Wales did come the lowest, but actually one of the things it did recognise was the steps that Wales had taken to actually providing IT kit to people was the best out of the 4 nations. So I think in that Education Policy Institute report, There was a range of different measures, and they were kind of differential depending which measure you looked at. So hopefully we can take both together and learn from both, Councillor Croker.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Will. Councillor Joe Watkins, do you want to come in?
It's okay, thank you, Chair. Sharon actually answered my question, so I took my hand down.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you. Obviously, blended learning is a different experience in terms of the digital side. Has there been any assessment of how well children are doing who have free school meals and those who don't, just to see how much they're engaged and how much sort of equivalent to what we would normally term as homework and assignments are actually being completed in comparison with what would be expected if they were in a school environment. I think I'd be interested in knowing that particular thing. And I think on occasions, you know, instead of marking books to avoid touching due to COVID, they might be actually completing online assessments instead. And it's really a question of what engagement there is there and how to assist those who aren't coping as well. I mean, that's the first question. The second question is in relation to the curriculum in Wales. I appreciate that one aspect of the curriculum in Wales is to develop digital competency, and obviously this is an area that is being increased in a sense as a result of this pandemic. But the other concern that is being put forward by some of the schools in relation to basically the new curriculum is that you know the schools have got enough to cope with dealing with blended learning, and there seems to be this relentless timetable which hasn't been delayed in putting forward this new curriculum, which will obviously require extra training and resources. And I just wondered if there is an argument to say that this should be postponed at this particular time, because the build timetable is going through at the same pace, and you know there's enough pressure on staff at the moment because of this. And I know that the pioneer schools might be more prepared for the new curriculum than other, but they're only a small percentage of the schools. So I just wondered what your views on that were, because obviously the Professor Donaldson's Successful Futures has got 4 purposes to it, and there's going to be quite a bit of new guidance and certainly a new areas of learning, and you know a radically different approach to teaching, you know, and how can schools be expected to cope with all that on top of what they've got at the moment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions, Councillor Brown. If I start with the first one, certainly during the summer term, we schools were very keen to keep a track of the engagement of all learners, but with a particular focus on those vulnerable and free school meal pupils. Whilst I would say in the early stages, the uptake wasn't as high, certainly schools were absolutely maintaining regular contact with those groups of learners to ensure that they had the equipment that they needed, the information they needed, and support as required. And as we said earlier on this morning, we talked about particular vulnerable learners that maybe weren't engaging quite so well, that we were able to look at engaging in learning through attendance at hubs or different kinds of support that we could give them. Certainly, we are tracking free school meal pupils and engagement really closely. We have meetings set up with schools in the next week or so to go through their school development plans and to look at their accelerated learning plans and as to how that will meet and support the needs of our free school meals pupils going forward. With regard to distance learning, a lot of the best learning that you have is the feedback you get. And that's still very possible through a distance learning model, through a blended learning model. So in some cases, schools have been using a technique called flipped learning for quite some time, where a lot of the learning would have been done independently and at home, or in small groups, and then that would be brought to a general classroom where the teacher would be then giving feedback based on what the learners bring back. So instead of learning and then going away and then having feedback, learners are learning first. And so the feedback is more, it's actually the response to it is more positive and more immediate for that learner, and it makes a more successful learning process. So there are lots of different ways that feedback is taking place. Very early on, it would be fair to say that teachers were trying to give formal feedback in the same way they'd always done right at the beginning. It became quite overwhelming for both the students and for the teachers themselves. And over time, they've worked through their models to make it manageable and more effective for both learners and for teachers. So there will be some online assessments, and students will do that over time, but they will primarily be the best and most effective way of moving learning forward for individuals. So hopefully that's the answer to the first question, Councillor Brown. So if I move on to the second one, yeah, we know that the curriculum for Wales is coming in. But as we said right at the beginning, blended learning is really the way forward for us to deliver the curriculum so that children have the opportunity to develop those skills through a range of contexts so that they can make learning realistic for themselves and they can benefit from it. So it has accelerated that process a little earlier than we would have thought, we thought. However, I understand that the curriculum for Wales seems to be, coming towards schools really quickly at this minute in time. But the curriculum will come online as agreed. However, how it's evaluated at that point and whether schools are expected to be up and running and perfect at that point, given the circumstances that we have experienced at the moment, I think is quite unlikely. Very recently, the region returned one of their surveys, and that was very much the point. A lot of work has already been done by many schools in moving forward to the delivery of the new curriculum, but we do accept that it isn't going to be perfect. And I don't think it would have been, even had we not had the pandemic, but that will have had a little bit more impact on it. I would also say that this period of time has given our schools, and particularly our clusters, the opportunity to share resources. So, for example, I know one of our clusters has a shared database where they are uploading their examples of practice for everyone. So they're looking at all the different areas of learning, they're looking at all the different year groups, and resources are constantly being shared so everyone can use them. So that is certainly supporting, our schools and our teachers in order to be able to make the process manageable.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. Any other questions or issues? Louise, if you're fairly brief now, because time is running.
Yeah, very quickly. Yeah, I think my concern is that the bill is still carrying on. And basically, it can be brought into force. And the other thing is that I've been involved in drafting legal amendments and things like that because I'm trained as a solicitor, and I'm very concerned about the way that bill is drafted because it's got 55 references to mandatory in it, and it seems to be opposed to the general sort of approach of local curricula and so forth. And even criminal legislation only uses mandatory in relation to, for example, mandatory life sentences. And I'm a bit concerned about the use of such forceful language. The Education Act 1996, for example, had no references to mandatory, and that's not the way that you deal with education in a cooperative basis with heads, with schools, with teachers, and I'm a bit concerned about that type of approach.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Sharon, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just in response to that, I understand your point, Councillor Brown. However, when as a region we reviewed our view on the curriculum and whether it should continue as it is, we also looked at lots of responses from other head teachers, from trades unions, for secondary head groups, to also understand how it felt if you were in school and delivering. And generally, most groups came back with the view that the flexibility of the way that the schools need to work at the moment were really, really supportive, but also the flexibility in the new curriculum was enabling them to make learning experiences valuable and worthwhile for children and young people. However, they're still mindful that the curriculum will come into force as agreed. So, I do take your point.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just the way the legislation is drafted doesn't really seem to line up with that flexibility
If I could stop you there, Louise, really, we can't change the legislation here online now, so I think we're going to have to come to a stop on that.
But it's an issue for teachers and schools, yeah.
Yes, no, yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, if there are no other questions or issues, thanks, Sharon, for coming today to give us an update on blended learning. I think that phrase is probably branded in the mind of every teacher in every school in Monmouthshire and elsewhere and on this committee. But interesting points raised and reassurance given today about blended learning, and obviously it is here to stay at the moment, isn't it? It's not going to go away, and the better that schools get at delivering blended learning and the more support the authority can give, the better, because that that is what it is at the moment. Interesting points raised about the research from NFER, which we perhaps look at in the future, about Wales coming bottom in terms of how they're performing. Interesting as well, the issues about free school meal performance. Obviously that is something that we always try to really keep an eye on, and obviously concern about children who are not in such a supportive background as others. Children in a supportive background probably find blended learning possibly a bit easier, where there are parents in the background who can help with it, and where they've got that support. Keen as well, I'm certainly keen, I'm sure the committee is keen to track the engagement of learners, both obviously in the classroom, but more importantly now when it's done online via the internet, and that is probably more difficult. The issues that were raised about distance learning, they are obviously valid, and it's something that this committee will need to keep an eye on as we move forward, and undoubtedly we will come back to this. Also, the issue about the new curriculum coming in 2022. I note Councillor Brown's point, concerns about that. It is a major change, but to a certain degree, I think we've been reassured by what you said, Sharon, about schools appreciating the flexibility of the new curriculum and some of the skills now that are being learnt in the current situation, which will be of value moving forward. So, once again, thanks for your input this morning. And I must say we've had a really good morning this morning in terms of having those 3 good presentations, and which in a sense link up with what is going on, and particularly as far as vulnerable children are concerned. And it's been good to broaden the focus, not just, as it were, school-based and looking at assessments and results and so on, but actually looking at children's services and what they actually do. So thanks to all of the presenters this morning. We'll move forward now then, and we go to item 9, and just to sort of update you in terms of the forward work programme. Looking at it as it is at the moment, we really need to put in an extra meeting, and we discussed this in the pre-meeting about having an extra meeting in November, subject to obviously availability of Will and Sharon Randall-Smith. The 2 items there that we probably will look at is to look at what has happened to the pupils who've gone now from Mountain House now that it has closed, and also to look at ALN provision within the authority. And Wendy Barnard will be in touch about the meeting dates sometime in November. Then the December meeting, we will then have probably three items, but in December the 8th, the head of housing, Ian Bakewell, wants to bring a paper forward on homelessness, and particularly looking at the approach to homelessness amongst young people, which is a crucial issue in my opinion, and we'll be looking at that. We'll also have a paper on the play scheme being brought forward by Mike Moran, and also we need I had an email yesterday and discussed this with the scrutiny officers, a paper on Welsh medium provision in Monmouth, which is the new school, and which needs to be discussed before the end of this year. And I'm proposing that we have that, although it'll be quite a busy morning, we have that as well in December. So any comments on the work programme? Are people fairly happy with that? Will?
Thanks, Chair. Just a question, really. I think it's really positive to bring back the work around ALN, and obviously that's been developed significantly since our Eston inspection. And I know that's something that the committee rightfully needs to have a look at. I would just pose a question. Clearly Mountain House has now closed. The children who were there have either returned to their home authorities or have been placed into new kind of settings. That was all shared prior to the summer break, as far as I recall. I just wonder what value that will be in terms of unpicking that again. But I really do welcome the opportunity to talk to the committee about the development of ALM provision and that clear vision that is clearly been a significant part of our work programme.
Okay, thanks, Will. Go to Councillor Grocott. I'll come back on that issue now. But Councillor Grocott, do you want to come in?
Thank you. Yeah, just to add that you mentioned the Welsh provision in Monmouth, and I believe that's part of the 21st Century Schools programme. I would like to be kept updated quite regularly, really, I suppose, on what's happening about in Abergavenny. Because as a governor of King Henry, at our governing body meetings, we do wonder, it's all gone very quiet. Hopefully by December time, we might know a bit more, but I'd like to add that on an ongoing basis, really.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Grogan. I think that's a valid point. Will, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think for point of clarity, really, I think the December item around Welsh medium provision, I think that would certainly be, although provision in and around the Monmouth area will be an aspect, I think what we'd really like to do is just to test some broader themes around Welsh medium with the committee. So if we could do that, that would be excellent. Of course, Councillor Grocott, entirely comfortable in bringing something around the kind of progression of the capital works in Abergavenny as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Will. If I can just add to that, because obviously, as my accent belies, I have a huge interest in Welsh medium issues. As you all know, I'll death about them, but I do think it's important, and obviously the implication with King Henry development has an implication on Ysgol Gymraeg Avenni and obviously Welsh media provision, throughout the authority. So I think that can be covered then. Councillor Louise Brown.
Yeah, I did actually get a very short table on where the destination on an anonymous basis of the different pupils from Mountain House School went. But I think it would be, having looked at that table, I think it would be useful if that information was shared with the committee. And the whole point of scrutiny is to scrutinise areas that perhaps the services themselves don't want scrutinising, because, you know, I think, well, every time I raise this issue, I get a negative response, and it's taken me quite a number of emails just to get back, you know, where the destination of those pupils was. And I think also it fits into the ALN type of strategy, because of the fact that there was different types of things that Newport are doing, like I think it was something like alternative living and things like that. And I think it's useful for the committee to know that sort of information. And I can't understand the reluctance to discuss this, because I think it's an important issue.
Chair, can I come back, please?
Yeah, well, yeah, obviously come in, please.
Just to be absolutely categorical, I think at this stage, I have absolutely no hesitance in sharing the measures and the steps we took to place those children in appropriate settings. I do have a challenge with sharing where individual pupils are going and commenting on what their needs were. I just don't think that, and we were talking about literally a handful of pupils. And if we end up talking about a handful of pupils, then we risk disclosure about where those children are. We risk discussing about individuals, which I don't think is for a committee. However, I do absolutely think it's appropriate that the committee is forensic in its understanding of our ALN population, and is absolutely forensic in its challenge to us about the steps we're taking to be able to provide for them in the future. So I've absolutely no hesitance in, you know, bringing that to the committee, but bringing back a very, very small number of children's placements, I don't think is appropriate. But I'll be guided by colleagues in Democratic Services.
Yeah, I think could I come back on that, because
yeah, briefly,
you wouldn't necessarily have to put a table. You could just say that you know, the pupils went to different schools, and then describe the different schools and the sort of things that they provide. And I do think, I don't know anything about this Newport alternative living idea, and I would be interested to hear, and I'm sure the rest of the committee will be interested to hear what the different approaches are. And
okay, well, thanks. I think we'll stop there. I think, you know, in terms, we could sort of discuss this now for quite some time. I note Louise's point of view, and I note Will's, and I think perhaps Will and I need to have a discussion, you know, after this meeting, rather than getting into quite an involved discussion now, which really the public, you know, aren't really aware of. So we'll put a question mark on that. But, you know, I do think we need some sort of generic input there. But I think Will and I and Democratic Services need to discuss this after the meeting.
I think if it was on a generic basis, I'd be happy with that. But the alternatives that are out there, and the different methods of dealing with ALN is part of the bigger picture. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Councillor Brown. Okay. I think we've fairly sorted the work programme. We're certainly not going to have a quiet November, December on CYP. Obviously, the item agenda 10, Council and Cabinet work plan, is just there for information. 11. Confirm the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 8th of September. Everybody quite happy with the minutes? Okay.
Yes,
we take those as read and accepted. 12, to confirm the date and time of the next meeting. The next scheduled meeting is December the 8th for CYP. But as I say, Wendy Barnard from Democratic Services will be in touch. We will have a meeting sometime in November, certainly to look at ALN, and obviously the discussion which we need to decide on between then and now with Democratic Services about Mountain House. But that date will obviously be circulated. Thank you all for your time this morning. Thanks to all the presenters. I know some might have left now. It's been a very fruitful morning. Thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr, and I hope you have a I was going to say a safe journey, but I'll just say have a safe switch off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Then.
Thank you.
Thank
you,
you.
Will.
Matt, can I have a quick word?
Don't know if he's gone, Chair.